good to start. Okay, good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Jane. I'm the coordinator of Global Education Professional Programs and a faculty member in the School of Math and Science. It is my privilege and great pleasure on behalf of Global Education Advisory Board to welcome you all to the virtual 2023 Murthy Reihl Global Education Leadership Lecture Series. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few items with you. I'd like to remind everyone that this is a virtual event, so please stay muted during the entire time. You will get the opportunity at the end to ask questions to our guest speakers. It will be a 15-minute Q&A session. For the question, please write your question in the chat box. On March 11, 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. The pandemic has placed an unprecedented burden on the world economy, healthcare, any globalization through travel, events cancellation, employment workforce, food chain, academia, and healthcare capacities. Thank you to all of you for taking time to join us today as we talk about the health and economic impact of COVID-19. And now it is my honor to have the privilege to introduce to all of you a great leader, the president of our college, Dr. Kurtenitis.
Well, thank you, and welcome to all of you. I want to thank Dr. Jana and all of those who've been coordinating this event for us today. But it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the annual Murthy Reihl Global Education Leadership Lecture Series. This special event rises from the talent, dedication, and generosity of two very special people, Donna Reihl and Sheila Murthy. Donna Reihl was CCBC's Dean of Community Education for many years, and sadly, she passed away in 2011. She was an amazing person, full of positive energy and a very strong supporter of global education. And the other individual we have to acknowledge, and we will meet today, is our generous and talented friend, attorney Sheila Murthy, president of the Murthy Law Firm and a leader in the field of immigration law. Talented, progressive, and genuinely a buoyant lover of life, Sheila Murthy has received numerous awards and is widely recognized for her professional achievements and her philanthropic work. She was a dear friend of Donna Reihl, and I might add, a great friend of CCBC. And at Donna's passing, she established an endowment on behalf of her friend to make this global education lecture series possible, and how grateful we are for her vision and her continued support of CCBC's efforts to broaden the worldview of our students. Now, before we introduce today's speakers and before I formally introduce Sheila Murthy, let me just say a word about the significance of the annual Global Education Lecture to our college and to our college's global education program. Our college, CCBC, is a comprehensive community college. We are passionately committed to an open door mission of universal access and success. We are a diverse community, a microcosm of the communities we serve, those who are newly arrived, as well as the established and settled. And our commitment to global education goes well beyond hanging international flags on each campus library. So each year, we welcome several hundred international students from 45, 50 countries to study at CCBC. And I might add that with us today, we have two very special guests, two Humphreys Fellows, human rights expert, Dr. Zainab Ouaba from Morocco, and linguistics TESOL professor, Dr. Renee Figuera from Trinidad and Tobago. So on any given day, you should know that in any CCBC classroom, you can find the nephew of an African tribal chief, the daughter of a Nepalese Sherpa, or a Vietnamese elder sitting next to a doctor's son from Perry Hall, or a single mom from Dundalk. Some of our students wear burqas, or dashikis, others hoodies and blue jeans, and some three-piece suits. In our hallways, you can hear Russian, Thai, Urdu, English. So more than ever, as we emerge from the pandemic, everyone we touch, from the CDL truck drivers we train at the college's Trade Point site, to a future engineer from Baltimore City, everyone needs to know how to interface within a wired.
Oh, you've become mute. Sorry, Dr. Kurtnitis, you're mute now. Somebody hit mute. You're back on mute. I'm not sure what, they unmuted you and then muted you right back.
Now, can you hear?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, very good. Okay. So we must educate students to fit into a technologically literate yet humane citizenry, able to thrive and not just survive in the world as a global village. So with pride and pleasure, I want to introduce the namesake of our lecture series, who will introduce our speakers. And I'm talking about attorney Sheila Murthy, lawyer, entrepreneur, philanthropist, and speaker, well known as founder and president of the Owings Mills Murthy law firm, and ranked as one of the United States leading immigration law firms. She is a woman who has excelled in the challenging field of immigration law, and it is through her generosity, as noted early on, that we are able to host this lecture each year as part of our commitment to prepare our students to be citizens of the global village. May I introduce our good friend, Sheila Murthy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kurtnitis. I really appreciated your passion, dedication, interest for CCBC, and the way you describe the tribal chief and the Sherpa and all of that is just your determination and the success and what you've done with CCBC is so self-evident. So being a friend and a supporter of CCBC is so easy. Seeing you, your passion, and your team, your leadership team, and the students, each and every one of them is just very impressive in their own right. And like you said, you can have really wealthy people, single mothers, people international from all over the globe. And so doing this in honor of my friend, who, by the way, for many of you who are aware of Girl Scouts, because I know Girl Scouts are a global movement, that's how I met Dr. Donna Reihl. And as Dr. Kurtnitis just explained, her energy, her determination, her friendship, her warmth is something that is sorely missed. I wish she were here with us. Her 10th year anniversary was during COVID, and we, I guess, didn't have an event. But then after that, I know we ended up having it the following year, I believe, on Zoom. And we are so honored and delighted today to have two amazing, brilliant, fabulous speakers that are really going to talk about topics that we don't generally hear about in the news or in the media or focus. And I think it's so important and so impressive that CCBC is able to host these really creative, entrepreneurial, if you will, talks and have the ability to invite speakers. So without further ado, let me take the opportunity to introduce our first speaker for today, Dr. Ifat Unisa Syed. As many of you have probably already seen in the flyer that you have about our speakers, her passion and determination is obviously in the field of occupational health, safety, and well-being of workers in a variety of settings. She is currently an assistant professor and program coordinator for health policy and administration at Penn State in Shenango. Her work as a health services and policy researcher is focused on advancing equitable working and living conditions through social determinants of health, of and it really to highlight health access and outcomes based on gender, based on race, based on immigration status. As an immigration attorney, that was really interesting as well for me. She's obviously authored, as you can imagine, a lot of papers, academic publications, reports. She supervises students actively in research and in their publications. She is an expert in long-term care and is invited, like she's today, to speak at research and policy conferences, seminars across the globe. Let's all give a warm welcome to Dr. Syed.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Murthy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Syed. The floor is yours.
All right, so I'm going to first share my screen. So once again, thank you to CCBC for hosting me. I'd like to, I will start, so the title of my presentation is The Health and Economic Impact of COVID-19 in Global Cities, and I'll actually use a case example of Toronto, okay? And I'd also like to start with land acknowledgement. So I acknowledge that I'm currently located in the original homelands of the many indigenous nations, including the Erie, the Haudenosaunee, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and Tuscarora, Lenape, Delaware Nation, Delaware Tribe, Stockbridge, Munsee, Shawnee, Absentee, Eastern, and Oklahoma, Susquehannock, Wazizi, Osage Nations. We acknowledge and honor the traditional caretakers of these lands and strive to understand and model their responsible stewardship. We also acknowledge the longer history of these lands and our place in that history. And this acknowledgement is actually found at Penn State's website. Okay, so today I will talk about COVID-19. I will focus on a global city as a case example, being Toronto. And I will talk about what happened during the pandemic, how did decision-making change, and how did strategic planning change, and what were the health and healthcare impacts and economic impacts of COVID-19 on Toronto. Okay, so you're probably wondering, why am I focusing on Toronto? So Toronto is a multicultural mega city, and it's a global city. It's the 4th largest city in North America. It has rich sources of data and research that we can draw upon. It has a large ethno-racial diversity. 51.2% of residents are immigrants and 51.5% are racialized. The economy is estimated to be about $158.7 billion. This is as of 2018. So it is, that has changed obviously as a result of COVID-19. The population consists of about 2.96 million people at the core, and then 6.2 million people in the Greater Toronto Area, the GTA. The landmass is about 630 square kilometers in the core and 5,903 square kilometers in the Greater Toronto Area, the GTA. So there is some urban sprawl. And for comparison, I have London, Ontario, London, England. London, there is a London, Ontario, but we're talking about London, England here, which has a population of 8.98 million people for the core and 8.9 million in the Greater London area. And the landmass is much smaller than the GTA. It has 1,572 square kilometers. So Toronto has some urban sprawl, but it is still densely populated. So how did the COVID-19 pandemic affect Toronto? So there were lots of case counts and unique patterns that we saw. There were 376,808 cases as of November 15th, 2022. I realize this is last year's data, but actually the dashboard that Toronto was collecting was no longer updated due to the provincial government. And for comparison, Philadelphia had a case count of 396,571, and Allegheny County in Pennsylvania had a case count of 342,628, and that was as of this year. So it's possible that the case counts could have increased in Toronto if, there was the dashboard continued. There were also racial and ethnic issues. In the beginning, there was no data collection at all by race. And there were also class and socioeconomic status issues. Initially, non-health sector workers were excluded from policies, and we'll talk about some of those policies. I also have a chart here. I know it's difficult to see this, but it shows the share of the Toronto population in green, and it shows also the share of COVID-19 cases by when the data was collected eventually by ethnic and racial groups. This is what we found. We found that there were there was an overrepresentation of COVID-19 cases in particular groups. So, for example, here, the 48% of white people make up 48% of the share of Toronto's population. However, there was 31% of the share of COVID-19 cases. So it was underrepresented. However, for Arab, Middle Eastern, West Asian, Black people and Latin American people and South Asian or Indo-Caribbean and Southeast Asian people, they were actually represented with COVID-19 cases. Okay, so that was a really interesting thing that we were seeing pattern. So what else happened? What happened? So COVID-19 disproportionately affected vulnerable populations in Toronto. Canada previously experienced a coronavirus outbreak known as severe acute respiratory syndrome in 2003. SARS was a significant event that also impacted Toronto's economy and tragically included the loss of frontline healthcare workers. Nearly 2 decades later, major cities around the world have experienced the crippling effects of the novel coronavirus pandemic. There are currently 763 million infected cases and 6.9 million fatalities globally. And so let's talk about SARS first. So SARS resulted in more than 8,000 cases worldwide in 2003. It affected 26 countries. In Canada, there were 438 probable and suspect SARS cases and 44 deaths. And that seems to pale in comparison to the current pandemic, but SARS really brought about a lot of fear in people because coronavirus was known to infect animals previously, like cats and dogs and domesticated animals. And it was known to cause gastrointestinal effects. But the novel part of SARS was that it was now affecting the respiratory system, and it was rapidly infecting people and killing people very rapidly. And this was the first time in the 21st century that you started seeing things like something at a global event happening, and quarantine measures and masking being brought in as measures. So what was SARS like? It chiefly affected healthcare workers. There was an absence of rapid tests to distinguish this new disease from pneumonia, influenza, and other outbreaks, unlike the rapid testing that we have now. Phase 1 started with a case of a husband and wife who returned from Hong Kong on February 23rd, 2003. The wife died on March 5th. The husband was hospitalized on March 7th. Nosocomial transmission in the hospital began. The husband was diagnosed with TB pending additional diagnosis and was isolated from other patients, but not his family, who visited him on March 8th, 9th, and 10th. On March 12th, the World Health Organization stated that a new severe respiratory syndrome was spreading in Vietnam and Hong Kong. On March 13th, the husband, patient A, died, and his family members also started to get sick. Family members of patient A were unfortunately hospitalized in 3 different hospitals in Toronto. And patients who were originally in the same ER with patient A also got sick and died. Family members of these patients also began getting sick, plus the paramedics involved in readmission, the ER staff, the additional hospital staff, like ancillary workers. Ancillary workers don't have direct contact with ER patients, but and they can include people involved in food preparation, cleaning, laundering, and other services, but they were also getting sick. So this was really interesting to see this. And on March 25th, the Ontario government designated SARS as a virulent disease, which enabled public health officials to track infected people and implement quarantine measures. On March 26th, the Ontario government declared SARS a provincial emergency, and all hospitals in the Greater Toronto area were ordered to carry out Code Orange to suspend non-essential services, which we now saw in the COVID-19 pandemic, the peak of the pandemic. On May 14th, the World Health Organization removed Toronto from a list of areas with local transmission, meaning that they thought the outbreak came to an end. Mhm. So we saw a couple of waves of SARS, as you can see here. And with COVID-19, we saw several waves. So on May 20th, 5 patients were diagnosed with illness, and by May 23rd, the hospital was closed and to all new admissions. This was North York General Hospital. Staff from this hospital were ordered to quarantine for 10 days. And by mid-June, the second phase of infections ended. So we saw only 2 peaks, 2 waves, okay, unlike the current pandemic. So what was the economic impact of SARS in Toronto and the GTA? Cancellations at Toronto, Greater Toronto area hotels led to $39 million in lost revenues during the month of April 2003 alone. Bus and tour companies were also hit hard. More than 800 bus tours were canceled, with an estimated economic loss of $5 to $6 million. Fewer people were dining at restaurants. Restaurant business was down between 20 and 30%. So restaurants were not ordered to close operations by public health officials at that time, but interestingly, people voluntarily started to become hesitant about being in public outings. Conventions were canceled. The cancellation of one healthcare convention probably cost the region about $6 million. That was not all. In 2003, news of local SARS outbreak led to racial panic. SARS was labeled as a Chinese disease. Racist people screamed SARS at Asian children and their families. Some Torontonians enacted an informal boycott of the Chinese community that stigmatized Asian Canadians and devastated Asian-owned small businesses. Asian-owned small businesses lost up to 80% of their income that year from the SARS scare. Some of them permanently closed down. Some of these changes that we saw never recovered, no recovery. Some of those businesses never came back. Tourism in that area permanently changed as a result of that. There was an inquiry. The Ontario government's post-SARS commission found cases of Chinese workers getting terminated from their jobs and tenants unlawfully evicted by landlords. So we did see some of these things happening, unfortunately. One of the positive things that occurred was that the Rolling Stones and others, such as Justin Timberlake, held a fundraising concert to support Toronto's economy. Unfortunately, Justin Timberlake was booed off of the stage. So now let's shift back to the focus to COVID-19. So various problems have been revealed with COVID-19, this current pandemic, especially in long-term care in Ontario. Hospitalizations and deaths occurred in hotspots, predominantly in vulnerable, low socioeconomic status, racialized neighborhoods in Toronto. This amplified problems due to socioeconomic status and certain policies. For example, night shift workers, essential workers, and the lack of paid sick leave really impacted case counts. The domestic care burden shifted back onto the shoulders of women and was rendered invisible. So remember, a lot of the daycare centers were closed. Students never returned after March break to some of the classrooms. There was an abrupt shift to online learning with little preparation. People did not have enough bandwidth sometimes to support some of these shifts, like within households. And women had to also care for children while also working from home. So there were shifts in, the occupational expectations to remote work. So what were some of the changes in decision-making for COVID-19 related events in Toronto? So there were multiple waves. There was a second and third wave, which had significant shutdown. Vaccination efforts were mixed by age, at-risk populations, and area. There were never enough vaccines because of per capita distribution policy, which means that equal numbers of individuals in a region received equal vaccines. This one's an Ontario level, government level policy. In other words, they ignored how far apart people lived or how closely people lived. So large rural areas got the same vaccines as small but dense neighborhoods in Toronto. There were learning opportunities. Perhaps there would have been better outcomes if there was involvement of primary care, which enabled success for cities like in London, England, although the latter prioritized vaccination by age only. So what happened if we mapped COVID-19 prevalence by census tract? Here, the data showed, as you can see, the red areas are hotspots. And this data showed a correlation at the census tract level between low vaccination rates and higher visible minority populations, higher material deprivation, and higher prevalence of COVID-19. And there was a less clear correlation for income. Why? Because various levels of income, sources, and reporting can occur. Okay. And so what were the indices used for some of these measures? So in Ontario, the marginalization index was used, which includes factors like economic factors, ethno-racial measures, age-based measures, and social marginalization. For comparison, in the UK, there is an index of multiple deprivation, which consists of 7 items. This includes income, education, employment, health, barriers, the living environment, and now it includes crime. So initially there were 6 and now there's 7 measures. Okay, so what happened in long-term care? Long-term care homes had military and federal intervention. Canadian long-term care residents had 81% of all reported COVID-19 deaths in Canada. This was high compared to 38% in the UK and 33% in the US. So as you can see in European countries, there was like 58% of deaths in long-term care. And so Canada has a unique case. It had 81%, so it's very high. And as you can see, residents were isolated because of some policies. Families were not allowed to visit workers. Initially, were limited to a single long-term care home. Care work was not being carried out at all. The military had to intervene. As you can see in this picture, these long-term care residents are looking out the window to their family members and looking for family members. And these are the family members. Okay. And in this picture, again, people are staring outside, and this just demonstrates elderly isolation. And I believe there's a study that actually shows that elderly isolation is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So it's actually really bad for people's cardiovascular health. Okay. And we know that cardiovascular disease is the #1 reason for mortality. So what were the issues in long-term care? Nurses, personal support workers, dietary aides, recreation therapists, and other staff often work in part-time, multiple locations and can become unintentional carriers of the virus. Most workers were not unionized. They were not entitled to paid sick leave. They would unlikely be able to stay at home as a result of injury, illness, or disability in fear of potentially losing their earnings because if they don't work, they don't get paid. There were shortages also of personal protective equipment and restrictions on visitors, including unpaid and essential caregivers and family members who often helped with the work that was carried out. And so again, when we have policies in place restricting people from participating in some of this care work, then you have work that doesn't get done. You have understaffing. And there were specific socioeconomic conditions and social determinants of health, which were also often overlooked. So carpooling and crowded living arrangements contributed to the rapid spread of COVID-19. People, for example, living in multi-generational homes, with grandparents, parents, and then siblings, which could contribute to the spread of COVID-19. People using the Toronto Transit Commission, which is a public transport system in Toronto, could also contribute to this. Low wages are also barriers to workers' health and well-being. And the government did implement a temporary paid sick leave for 3 days for long-term care workers, for example. But advocacy groups actually asked for 10. This paid sick leave was temporary, so it actually expired and was never renewed, despite the fact that, COVID-19, we still have COVID-19, and various variants have emerged. So perhaps some of these policy decisions should be reassessed and perhaps extensions should be granted. So or even make them permanent. So what were some of the equity issues with COVID-19 in Toronto? So Ontario and Toronto Public Health did not initially collect race-based data. Later, they changed this. It included race and discussions on racial equity. The province was sued for not doing enough for equity. For example, a case was filed on March 15th, 2021 by David Daneshwar, a Toronto man with a number of disabilities. Thankfully, a number of changes happened. Town halls were held with the members of the Black community, for example, and educational institutions kind of took a leadership role. They implemented programs, and some of these post-secondary institutions focused on Black health, for example, as some of the leading programs, these new programs that were offered. And also remember that this was also happening when there was a Black Lives Matter social movement taking place, not only in the United States, but also demonstrations happening in Toronto. So what was the economic impact of COVID-19? So Toronto actually lost $8.35 billion in just the first year of COVID-19, the pandemic, including $1.68 billion in the retail sector, $1.33 billion in the food services and beverage services sector, $1.21 billion in hotel and accommodations, $1.03 billion in finance, $0.81 billion in transportation, $0.707 billion in entertainment and attractions, and $1.59 billion in miscellaneous sectors. Plus, so not included in this total of 8.3 billion is the $1.44 billion in tax revenues for all levels of government. And why is this important? Because tax revenues help to redistribute wealth to and help government implement programs and services that are offered to vulnerable people, right? So there was a huge loss for everyone. So what are the other issues? There was actually also vaccine hesitancy. People were not getting vaccines when they needed and wanted them. Why? Because of per capita distribution. Remember, it was per capita distribution. So the flip side was that there was also some vaccine hesitancy, especially among racialized and marginalized groups. Vaccine hesitancy depends on socioeconomic status deprivation, the trust deficit, and trust deprivation. So remember the 20th century medical study on syphilis in Tuskegee, Alabama. The Toronto police, until very recently, when it was notoriously known for its carding practices of racialized people. Carding is an intelligence gathering policy involving the stopping, questioning, and documenting of individuals when no particular offense is being investigated. It was officially known as the community contacts policy. And it seems that this legacy impacted the ways in which people trusted structures and institutions. And around the world, we actually see some of this happening also in other countries with other vaccination strategies like for polio and things like that, although that's been changing now, thankfully. And here, what we see here is a long waiting line, okay? And this is not for this Toronto transit bus, although this is a bus shelter. These are actually people lined up for getting their vaccines, okay? And this is at a pop-up center, meaning that because there was not enough vaccines in neighborhoods that had a lot of high case counts, they would open up pop-up clinics, pop-up centers, vaccination centers. And so people lined up as soon as they found out that these opportunities existed. They lined up from 4 a.m. in the morning sometimes, and you can see they were wearing jackets, meaning that it was really cold, right? And for hours. And the problem was that administrators admitted they never had enough vaccines. You can see these are people lining up again for a vaccine, getting a vaccine at a COVID-19 vaccination clinic, pop-up center, okay? And this line is going around this field. The media sort of also took some interesting phrases. They said the early bird gets a vaccine, maybe. Again, if there were people lining up for the vaccine and they didn't have enough vaccines, people were turned away, okay? And so, people may have stood for hours waiting for the vaccine, and then they didn't eventually get one. So again, this was something, it's a learning opportunity, and I think it needs to be addressed. Some media called it the Hunger Games of trying to get a vaccine in a COVID-19 hotspot, okay? And that's it. Thank you so much. Okay. And
thank you, Dr. Syed. That was absolutely very, very informative, really kind of went through the nitty-gritty. And while many of us might have thought we sort of kind of knew and read the news, just having the that data, the statistics, just having you go through your detailed analysis and the impact on, what I think you refer to them as SES populations, really, I think helps to drive home the point. So I think we'd like to open it up. Or do we want to? No, we said we'll have both of them speak and then open it up for questions, correct? Is that the plan? Perfect. And so I think we'll absolutely do that. So then without further ado, let me go. We're shifting gears here, right? We're going to invite Dr. Oliver Schlake to discuss his research and his issues. And by way of introduction, again, another super rock star that's passionate. He's a clinical professor, not too far from us at the Robert H. Smith School of Business, University of Maryland. I came there and spoke several years ago, and I'm guessing you're in College Park because that's where the main campus for the school, Robert School Business School is. He's a senior business consultant. He's right now a clinical professor there, but he's also been a senior business consultant. He's obviously an entrepreneur. He's a researcher, scholar. His publications, very, very interesting, I thought, fascinating. And his research is on scenario-based strategic planning and innovation strategy. And, these have been featured in various academic and practitioner journals across the globe. He's been an international management consultant as well as a strategic advisor for leading both government and private companies across North America and in Europe. I think I lost my slide. Wait. And we have that prior to joining the Smith School of Business, Dr. Schlake was an assistant professor for e-business at National University San Diego and CEO for a German-based consulting company or consulting firm called Scenario Management International, SCMIAG. So really fascinating, as I said, different areas, but you will see, and I hope it'll help us all to think in creative and unique ways, seeing both these people, and who better to speak to than bright young minds that Dr. Curtinized has described from across the globe that can truly learn from these experts. So without further ado, Dr. Schlake, I invite you to get started. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sheila. I enjoy the international community that I'm seeing here. I can definitely not claim the immigrant status, being a blue-eyed white guy from Germany, but we have enough passports in the house to qualify, I guess. So
absolutely. You're a 100% immigrant if you're from another country. You may not be a marginalized immigrant or focused on color or from poverty or race, but you know what? I think even immigrants with high levels of education sometimes face the accent discrimination or different kinds of discrimination. So
it takes, and this is our experience here at home with my wife, it takes just to be female, and you're right in there. That's the sad experience, even in higher education. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk. My conversation with the audience here, I hope it's informing. I am not a healthcare professional. I am a strategic planner, and I teach strategy at the school and do other things. But I think COVID was one of those extremely enlightening and unfortunately sad examples that forces us to think about business, about organizations, and perhaps also of our own future a little bit more strategic and in many ways very differently than before the pandemic. And I hope I can share personal observations and also give a little bit of advice from what I've learned working with organizations in the past 2-3 years after and during the pandemic, of how strategy has shifted and how our mindset should shift, because we are I'm afraid we are just getting to the point of getting the pandemic behind us and just want to continue as usual. And I think that's a big challenge that we should not fall into. So I hope this is insightful and maybe even a little bit entertaining. A couple of observations here from my personal day-to-day time here. If you recall back in the mid-March 2020, this really serious first 2 months, we lost 20.6 million jobs in the United States within 6 weeks, literally 6 weeks. And every one of us knew about the living paycheck to paycheck, but we always never thought about that this paycheck could go away for more than the usual suspects. All of a sudden, 26 million people did not have this paycheck. And so the effect pushed the paycheck to paycheck vulnerability so further up the economic ladder that finally people paid more attention. We had this problem in the country, but we basically did not address this. Ideally, we would learn from that, and we would learn that there's a need for a collective push to create a more resilient economy. So we'll see if we ever get there, but that would be my challenge for all of us. Secondly, and I'm in the, I'm among friends here, educators, all of us. Hardly anybody was prepared for that. There were a couple of nerd professors out there, and I was fortunate to be one of them, who started teaching online in 2000 when it was absolutely uncool. And we used chat rooms to educate. That came in extremely handy when Zoom hit. But we also saw it after a while, Zoom is great, we can actually teach after, we kind of overcame the cold water shock of now you have to be online. But we also realized when we looked into that, that this is not an equalizer. Online education is by far not an equalizer. We learned from our studies with students that hardly anybody wanted to be on Zoom doing a lecture. I mean, they were there, but the cameras were off. And I was wondering in the beginning, why would this generation that kind of invented the selfie not be on Zoom? I mean, it's great, you can be on camera. And what we saw later on is that Zoom actually was projecting economics status, because kids did not want to share their personal environment. Some of them had to go back to their where they lived at home. They had to share their room with siblings. They saw parents walking through the picture, and they would basically showcase their economic status by what's behind them on the wall, et cetera, et cetera. And so we should learn now by them. The ideal lesson learned would be invest in education and make it more accessible with remote learning tools that do not propagate an educational status. And Ifat mentioned the lack of bandwidth and also the lack of tools. Having a laptop, having a shared laptop, having sometimes one laptop for 3 to 4 people to be in use was a real economic challenge, and we didn't have anything to combat this right away. Another thing that I think many of us here in the room got frustrated by is the kind of political gamesmanship that overshadowed, especially here in the United States, the whole effort to fight the pandemic, when us researchers and medical science got just pushed in a corner by basically a large-scale misinformation agitation campaign that had no real place in a situation like this. The thing that in my previous career, I was a futurist, still am, but not practicing as much anymore. But what we like to do as futurists, we like to look back. And believe it or not, in 1918, at the outbreak of the Spanish flu, poor Spanish people got the bad rap there. They were actually not responsible for that, but Spain in 1918 was the only country that after World War II had no press censorship and reported about the flu first. Was actually American soldiers who brought it back to America, returning from Europe. So the Spanish people got the bad rap there because they are still reporting on it. But in 1918, in the United States, there was a huge fight that broke out between people promoting the wearing of masks and those who decline to wear it. And so what we like to do as futurists, we like to go back in future and see, okay, what level of stupidity is possible? And so we include this in our conversation, right? And the level of stupidity was there. And I'm sorry, I called it out. But it was already there. People in 1918 were fighting whether this is limiting their rights as a civilian to wear the mask, you know. And so what we ideally should learn from that is a collective push to limit the influence of politics in our daily life and find common ground, especially in activities that have nothing to do with politics in the first place. And number 4 here is we saw that especially healthcare workers, they had to endure one of the harshest working conditions. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I have a nephew who is an EMT doctor in Baltimore, and he reported back of what happened there. And it was just mind-boggling. It was fascinating that people even showed up for this after a while. And of course, these are very passionate people, definitely coming out of the more than their call of duty was asking them for. But that has a timer. Resilience have a timer, and we cannot expect from any group of people to have a permanency in resilience. So we need to have systems that have redundancy and backups in the system. We didn't have them, especially not in the healthcare field. So resilience has a timer, and ideally we would strengthen the ability of the public healthcare system, which we're kind of not doing, and to build in redundancy and backups. And just an idea here to throw it out. Why don't we have an equivalent of the National Guard for defense, for domestic defense? We could have a kind of a National Health Guard where people sign up for a period of time, get trained as an part-time medical professional, and in times of this can be called upon, and we have a larger pool of people. I know, for example, a lot of students, if they get some sort of relief on their tuition cost in exchange, like we do this with the GI Bill or anything like this, and would then qualify for this kind of service. Yeah, and then last year, I don't have a slide on that, but since I had to say this because we are a multicultural group here, we should absolutely look into the multicultural benefits that some of us had. I'm telling you from my end, I grew up in post-war Germany. My parents were absolute, I would not call them hoarders, but we were stingy with everything. If I didn't eat my dinner, that was my breakfast, and so forth. So food waste was not a part. And on top of that, as a German, as a proper German, you have at least 2 freezers filled to the top with food. And so when the pandemic hit, my cultural upbringing had accidentally, I have 3 freezers in my house. And people question my sanity. I said, look, I grew up like this. I need to have 2 or 3 freezers full. And some of you also who know how to cook, who know how to culturally prepare food, you had the ability to actually self-cook. We were not dependent on fast food all the time. So I want to emphasize that this cultural dimension in the pandemic came out to play. Family bonds that are culturally much stronger in some communities played a pivotal role to making it through this time. So looking at the time here, I'm going to move on, and I want to share with you kind of an outdated time kind of way to deal with this situation. And I want to introduce some updated strategic thinking. Now, this is not purely for business. This can also apply to pretty much any type of organization. And to be honest, it can also be applied to your personal life strategy, because we have to plan differently looking ahead. This is a major topic in my classes when my students come in. I teach our BSE Scholars group that's about 160 students, freshmen and sophomore students, and I want to create resilience in them as a lesson learned. So I want to share some of my observations here, what we can see right now. So the normal mode of operation for many organizations is let's rebuild the pre-pandemic economy. Get people to work, get the systems back online. We've been successful with dropping most of the unemployment rate. Now we unfortunately have to deal with inflation, which is a direct outpouring, of course, of the pandemic that we've been seeing here. But the thing that happened during pandemic, from an organizational point of view, any organization who had a flawed business model who did not do well. These business models, this flawed business model, would just accelerate. You put a magnifying glass on this. The recent, if you look at Silicon Valley, the kind of holy grail of coolness, the amount of people who lost their job in the last couple of months, it is staggering. And if you ask me, the CEO of these companies should not get paid at all. That is an absolute non-emphatic way of kicking people out, telling, hey, we have to leave people because we hired so many during the pandemic. I think that these mass firings are also a social scourge, and none of these companies CEOs, to me, I will mention for a while in my class as being an example of great leadership. It's just poor leadership to have to put 10,000 people out of work because you couldn't see how your business is developed. So these business models are flawed, and we've seen this, and so we need to make an honest assessment here. We need to look at what's the root cause of economic scarcity. And every organization, I'm including educational organizations, because we are businesses more or less. We need to look at, do we have a viable business model moving forward? Is what we're doing, is this in some way, can this in some way be seen as a future model? How resilient is it? How susceptible are we to sudden change? Does my model actually fit in the future economy? And we've seen this already in the restaurant space. We got the Uber Eats and the DoorDashes, they all kicked up like crazy, and people got excited about this. But it was unsustainable for restaurants. The amount of money that restaurants had to give these services to deliver their food was not sustainable. Restaurants operate at hair-thin margins. They're in the 5 to 10% range, and they work mostly on volume. And these business models were just not sustainable. It allowed Uber Eats and these companies to make a lot of money. So we need to look into supply chain, the customer needs, how they evolve, and also how we deliver our services. And my advice to many organizations, before you start rushing things out of the door, start experimenting. Experiments are very well done while you're not in trouble, but they're absolutely devastating when you have to experiment under pressure. So if your organization has, at least hopefully at some point, some times of lull, meaning nothing crazy is happening, this is when you have to start experimenting. Or even better, when your business is great, do the experiment there. Creativity, experimentation goes out the window as soon as a crisis hits. So this is the time to experiment with new ideas. We just had yesterday was our pitch dingman competition at College Park, our largest entrepreneurial competition. And the winner in one of the categories was a student team who's basically thrifting used clothes and reprints them with new memorable kind of maps and etc. And they won $20,000. And it's a clear sign of a brand new business model. And a lot of young people appreciate the non-wasting and the upcycling. So we have to really think about those things. Another element of our strategic overview here is to look at how we manage crisis in general. And this is a cultural element here that I'd like to point out. We love, as the US community, we'd love to be hands-on for crisis, at least initially, right? People like to do this. We love the fireman who's rescuing the small cat out of the fire. And we saw this in the pandemic too. In the first couple of days, we saw executives in the front line, distributing food and water, and we celebrate, rightfully so, a lot of people who stepped up during the crisis. But let's look at a little bit at the root cause of that. The root cause of that is these medical health professionals became hero unwillingly. We didn't have to make them heroes if we had a system that was more resilient. Right? They stepped up because it's a responsibility, but they didn't have to do this. The fireman rescuing the cat shouldn't have to do this if the janitor would have put in a 9-volt battery every January in the smoke detector. This fire could have been spotted much earlier and put out before the whole building came to life. But who is celebrating the janitor who is doing this diligently and has the smoke detectors going? So we need to see, are we going to slowly praise the hero, sometimes the unwilling hero, or are we also putting effort in the way we treat these crises into those people who actually prevent these crises? In COVID, we pulled out so much funding from viral research, from vaccination research, which is a clear sign of, something that haunted us because we were so behind in the research. We didn't have the resources. We didn't even have emergency resources left. And so I think we need to see as a leadership skill, we need to promote leaders who create what we call hindsight accountability, meaning we have to evaluate who could have prevented this. We have to have people who anticipate crisis instead of just greatly reacting to crisis. A little story here. You're wondering, why do I have, I'm not endorsing the Tide Pods challenge, so don't get me wrong here. But I work with a company who makes the Kirkland washing pods. I can't even tell you who that is because that's kind of the big mystery when you're at Costco, right? This is what they sell, and there's a brand name behind it, but I work with them. I can't tell you what it is, but that's why you get the Tide Pods at good quality at a better price. Different story. Why did this company, in during the pandemic, a lot of companies basically were so streamlined, or prior to the crisis, everything worked just fine. This company couldn't deliver these Tide Pods, these wash pods anymore, not because their production was challenged, but what happened was their supply chain was disrupted because nobody would return pallets, and they were shipped on pallets. And another story that we all were familiar is the toilet paper issue, right? We didn't run out of toilet paper. There was plenty of toilet paper available. What we ran out is the nice to your behind 2-ply white toilet paper that you use at home to feel good. It was not the scratchy 1-ply that we use at work. There was plenty of that. I have good relationship to the guys who run our janitorial services at the business school. I made a call. I said, how much do we have left? And he said, millions of foot of this because nobody uses it. They got the deliveries in, and it comes in 10,000 feet rolls, of course. But what we realized at that moment is that our economy is so finely tuned for profit and for the way it works. And these fine-tuned machine, it's like a Formula One car. If there's a little bit something wrong with this thing doesn't function anymore. And we have to see if we want to build in this kind of supply chain resiliency, it costs money. We have to be aware of that. It is companies need to have multiple sourcing opportunities, and that's going to be a challenge, right? Redundancy and resilience is required. When we streamline these organizations, they work under ideal conditions. But if you throw a little wrench in this wheel, things don't work anymore. And companies have pushed to maximize the return that they're producing, but that comes at a cost. And COVID clearly showed that many of these organizations just didn't have any redundancies in their business. They worked on just in time. A Walmart was basically empty after 48 hours because Walmart's supply chain works on a maximum of 72 hours replenished. That means 48 hours in a Walmart, it is empty. Right? Costco ran out of chicken. That's almost un-American, to see that. I said, wow, now I'm reliving my life as it would be Eastern Germany at some point in the 80s or 90s, right? And so we need to see that these resiliency systems, they require investments and consideration from us in order to have some sort of safety net available. Yeah, and lastly, another consideration here. Of course, everybody, especially in the healthcare field, we'd like to prepare for this. We like to stockpile. I still have enough masks here for another COVID. I guess in my house, I the German kicked in again. I don't need a freezer for that, but I bought all this equipment. I have toilet paper. I don't even want to share that, but it's plenty. And we have work home concepts, health monitor. We do all these things to prepare. And this is good. This is important, especially we saw how vulnerable we are. But let me infuse another thought here. My thought is we cannot prepare for any eventuality. The definition of a crisis is usually that it comes fast and it comes unexpected. So how do we prepare for the fast approaching unexpectedness? You know, solar flares, EMP, crop disease, Yellowstone volcano, nationwide brownout, government ransom attack, cell phone disablement, you name it. There's plenty of, you know, as a futurist, I share you my other deep, dark thought about what could happen. But there's plenty of things. So what we as organizations and also as individuals need to see, we need to invest in people who are flexible. We need to invest in multi-purpose options instead of single-use consideration. We need to cherish improvisation. We need to cherish adaptability as a skill, cross-functionality in training. Even us in the educational field, you know, maybe we don't leave people with just one degree, but we also have a kind of a plan B degree. And we hope at the school that entrepreneurship is our plan B. You know, whatever your major is, we still have the opportunity for you to start your own business. And so that's one of the things. So what, as an organization, I always focus on, can we increase the what I call the crisis comfort zone of our people, meaning that what is today would be a crisis if we train people, if we show them, if we do sandbox exercise, if we think about the future, if we play around with solutions, we are continuously increasing that space. And what would otherwise be total devastation, chaos, becomes just a normal day at work. That is a big challenge, but as a mental model, I hope it can get some consideration. I want to share a little bit of a way how we do this in the strategic field and in my former responsibility in the consulting space, what we helped organizations do. What we built for organizations, I'm still doing this, I have to say. So we're helping companies when it comes to strategic foresight. We're building what is called early warning systems. And the best example that I have that is kind of more commonly known is the use of canary birds in mines. And until the 1980s, 1987 or so, the American Mining Association, they used, or the miners used canary birds. And they had these birds down in the mine because when the bird is breathing in unsuitable gas, it just tips over and is dead. And then for the miners, that was a sign to leave the mine. Canary birds were not chosen randomly. They're actually a bird species that breathes in and out and transmits oxygen in their bloodstream, both in the in-breathing and in the out-breathing. So they are a species that breathes basically twice, and that's why they're so susceptible to bad gases. You know, that's what you learn when you research this whole thing. But so the same thing, we need to have early warning systems. Could have prevented a lot of the catastrophes and challenges we see. There's examples from the Titanic, how many accidents the ship had before it even left the harbor. We are aware of the O-ring problem with the Challenger space shuttle. And Blockbuster should have been aware that when a company wants to sell you Netflix, there's something going on in the streaming world. And Blockbuster famously declined the offer to buy Netflix for $50 million. So the last component here, I know I'm out of time, but I want to show you just in principle how early warning systems work, and they work for you personally too. So let me show you a quick chart here. This is the blue line is any kind of signal. As an example, this is a little cavity in your tooth. Let's start with that, right? You have a cavity, a tiny little cavity, and your tongue figured out, oh, there's something there, right? And the tongue and the longer the cavity sits there, the stronger the signal gets. It gets worse and worse and worse, right? And we know the end game is usually tooth extraction or root canal, which if we wait, right? Because over time, the chance for intervention is limited. If you go to a quick drill and fill to your dentist, which nobody likes, but if you would go there, the chance for intervention would be high. Over time, it goes down. As an individual, we all have what we call a threshold level of awareness. That is basically at what time do we pay attention to some of these changes, right? At what time do you get to the dentist? What we saw in COVID was that we waited way too long. Our threshold for awareness was way too high. That means we ignored some of the signals. And Ifrit was talking about SARS. We completely missed out on SARS lessons learned. Because just because we didn't have that many dead people here in the North American region, nobody said, "Hey, you know, what if we multiplied this by 1,000, right? What happened then?" Nobody did this because it was convenient, it was gone, and SARS was forgotten. So there was precedent here, but our threshold level for awareness was too high. And when we detect things too late, there's little time to make a decision. And at the point we make the decision, we have almost no more way to intervene. Now, what we should do as individuals, I hope this comes across here in my Zoom, we increase the awareness. That means we are lowering our awareness. We are lowering our awareness threshold. That means we're starting to detect things much, much earlier. We're paying more attention. We're trying to run scenarios. We're trying to run sandbox exercises. We play things through, right? And when we have that, there are two chances that we have. If we detect things earlier, we have more time to make better decisions, or we save time to make quicker decisions. And either way, it's a benefit. But organizational, that takes a lot of challenge, because we are based, our organizations are based on mostly clear-cut data. Early warning includes ambiguity. People need to be willing to speak out. We need scientific minds. We need to experiment. We need to speculate, and we need to include this. But this is my kind of recommendation. If you'd like to do more of that, and I know my time is up, I leave it standing here. These are questions you could ask yourself and your organization. What are you missing when the next time when you feel a little toothache coming up, or the organization gets into troubled water? All right, and for those of you who want to do a little bit more on strategy, I shared with the organizers a little checklist it's called a strategy health check of your organization, and they are able to share this with you in an email after the session. We don't have time for that, but you can receive that. That's all I have, and thanks for the time you spent with me here, for someone who is more of a strategy guy and not a healthcare expert. Thanks.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Ifat. Oh my God, this was so brilliant. I mean, amazing, helpful. I love the helpful and the lessons learned that you talked about, because it's like you might hear and understand, but I think especially as we're kids, just in the middle of college, whether we're pursuing the AA degree, a bachelor's, a master's, joining the dots, telling people, here's what happened, here's how you can translate it, is absolutely brilliant. And I'm sure many of you in the audience today participating live and on Zoom, and there's a lot of you live and a lot of you on Zoom, and we appreciate each and every one of you being here, is actually to hire, I guess, if we wanted to consult with Oliver or Ifat, we'd probably be spending thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to get this information. It's being handed for free on a silver platter. And sometimes, as my dad would joke, if something comes free, we don't appreciate it as much as then if you pay a lot of money to get that same advice. So just because you got it for free, don't discount it. It's brilliant. It's fabulous. It's literally strategic. It could save you, your company, if you're going to become an entrepreneur, your business, if you're working in a business, or as Oliver just mentioned, even for CCBC as a university. I think all of this is so good. And as each of you was speaking, I was thinking, most of us think of, Winston Churchill is supposed to have said, right? An optimist is one who sees an opportunity in every challenge, and the pessimist is one who sees the challenge in every opportunity. Clearly, both Dr. Ifat and Dr. Oliver have used COVID and used the lessons learned and turned it on its head and tried to make lemonade out of the lemons, which was a tragedy, a worldwide global tragedy, but they have tried to glean the lessons from it for the benefit of all of us. So without further ado, I would like to invite people in person, and I guess CCBC will, for in-person questions that they may have for people. I'm not sure how, there are microphones for the students sitting there in who have attended in person, or whether we want it on Zoom. And if you have a thing, you could either put it on the chat. I'm happy to raise your question, or if you want to speak clearly. We do have a few minutes and would welcome your questions, your comments, your thoughts. Okay, we have Brahmacha Laguire. Brahmacha, go ahead. You want to unmute, Brahmacha? Please unmute. Perfect. Oh, we still don't hear you though. I see you've unmuted, but I can't hear your voice. Can't hear you. Why don't you type it in by chat, and we'll know it's you if you just want to stay there, and I can read it out, and then we'll hopefully hear from our brilliant speakers. While we're waiting for you to type it, I can't hear you, but let me see. It says NR. Nicole Richley, do you have suggestions to convince nursing homes to reform? They're short-staffed, and as a person who lived in one for years, volunteered in one, and in my experience, they only care about profitability. Can let Oliver lose on them and tell them the incredible costs that they would end up spending, and we've all seen it with COVID. So go ahead, Oliver.
Yeah. It's interesting, again, 2 days ago, another contestant on the show, on the entrepreneurial show, is a company called Wise Cities. It's a startup that is working with Fairfax now, and they actually created a portal to make the access to senior citizen services more affordable. So they basically combine all the county and statewide initiatives that are available for seniors, like support in transport. I think you were talking about the isolation component, so joining a bridge club, etc. And they're bringing basically a platform. It's not even phone-based, it's web-based, because most seniors are more comfortable initially on that one. And so the model of nursing homes, again, this is a business model. We have to question ourselves, is sustainable, right? And what's the long-term goal of this? Got a feedback here, somebody. Yeah, and we have to consider, is this business long-term sustainable? Because once a business gets into disgrace, I'm calling it, not every nursing home is like this, but once you have a community where hey, this is kind of feels like a rip-off, or it's a profitability scheme, etc. Anybody in this industry cannot sit still, because this thing escalates very quickly, and the whole industry gets into bad reputation. So I encourage a lot of people there to look for other business models. Retirement is a longer period of time. That changes too. The demographics will change that business model, because now people have to stay there 20, 30 years old. There's also opportunity in the transitional phase, where people not in the senior citizen home, but in between solutions. So I think that organizational space needs to really reconsider. I know there have been finance models out there where people basically sell their own house in order to buy a purchase in these communities. I worked with some people who had a kind of an investment model that people would buy into a nursing home, kind of a collaborative approach, where you have just a management team. So it's not solely owned by an organization, but it's owned in a co-op by people who live there. So all of these models have to be considered. And sometimes this is, and I'm running out of time, I know, but sometimes there's a cultural aspect too. We need to rethink how living with elderly should look like, right? We have enough cultural energy in colleges, etc., that we can import ways how other cultures, dealing is the wrong word, but interact with the elderly. The status of what an elderly person has, how we interact, how we respect elderly, how we integrate them in our daily lives, etc. We can learn from other places of models where this could work much better. Here it's almost like a fire and forget model, right? We put people in senior citizen and then they care everything. Maybe it's not a sustainable model.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Great question, great answer. Oh my God, I see Ifat, you want to chip in as well, and maybe this week we can at most have maybe one question, and I'm not even sure. I want to be sensitive to the time issue, but why don't I let you respond as well, Ifat, and then we can see if we have time for one more question, or we need to try to wrap up, because I know Dr. Kurtinitis and CCBC tries to wrap up and make sure that we're on time for the next class and lunch and all of those normal life. And by the way, both your slides were so amazing and helpful and brilliant. Would you be willing to share it for CCBC to share it? Or is that something that you have sort of patented service mark, trademark, love to use it and share it, because I think I would love to have, I guess if you're, I know the last speakers last year shared their email information for those who, or through the school at least for something. I know that it was something very helpful. Again, no pressure, but if you would love to hear, I'm sure the questions will be slide sharing, personal contact information. And okay, Dr. Ifat, floor is yours for response.
I just want to say quickly to respond to that question. I think using a health equity lens can convince organizations and businesses that happy, healthy employees will, positively impact the triple bottom line, which is people, profits, and the planet. So, when organizations and businesses look at just profits, it's going to be very limited. There's more broader impacts and more positive impacts when you use a health equity lens, when we start looking at things through, these different perspectives that focus on employee and worker health and well-being, and also think about, the people and the planet, right? And then profits will come along. I mean, organizations and businesses do much better when they think about the triple bottom line, as opposed to just thinking about, profits in just profits.
Thank you, Ifat. And you're absolutely right. The problem, like you said, is people keep pointing the finger at somebody else. The CEO will say, I'm beholden to the board of directors and the shareholders. I have to give them most value for the money. I don't care about the planet and long-term good thinking and, looking around curves. And like Oliver said, if you do build in a lot of redundancies for the emergency, like his 3 freezers and his number of toilet rolls that he has, companies are like, I can't afford to keep so much inventory in stock because that's going to eat into my profits. And 5 years from now, that may not be profitable. So it's like a circular chain. I think COVID really helped many of us to say, don't put on our blinders, look at the bigger picture, think of the lessons learned. But as Oliver also said, and you also pointed out, we didn't learn the lessons from the 2003 SARS to learn for the COVID-19. As Oliver said, 1918 was ignored. And even there we have this similar politics where people refuse to wear masks. I mean, talk about lessons learned. I mean, oh my God. Okay, we have time for maybe one last question, though I do see, just reach out to Nicole, I will thank. Let's see, there was one question, I think, who said, would it be possible at some point to discuss this with you further at another time? Because I would love to try and solve this problem, because my own long-term healthcare facility one day. Nicole Richley, you didn't get charged for today, Nicole. Oliver gave you, and if I gave you advice that if I'd hired them through my business or through the Indus entrepreneurs, they would have sent me a bill for probably $5,000 to go through this. So you just got your outline, but I'm sure they're extremely kind, generous, large-hearted people that want to make the world a better place, talking about people, profits, and planet. So I'm sure they'll
Sheila,
help.
there's always a path that I try to do, and one of the paths is for anybody who professionally likes to try things out. I have 160 students who are looking for tryouts, and that means I work on a regular basis with students to solve problems. We partnered for 6-7 years now with Under Armour to reduce their waste management. We're building waste, how Under Armour can turn waste fabric into new products. So that's one of the projects that we're currently working with. There are 30 students across UND planning with that. So I think we as educators have an opportunity here to actually help those who will be at the receiving end of all these problems, give an early shot at trying to fix them before these problems come up. The Wise City guys that built this app for senior citizens, their average age is 23. So they are basically 40 years away from being a target audience of what they're building. And so there's a great opportunity here involving the young generation in a smart way. And it requires, perhaps from a teacher perspective, and I know there might be some colleagues in here, and probably if you're in here, you already know this, but it requires teachers who have the flexibility to try things out. We need to experiment too, and we need to be willing that a class may not be run perfectly because we're experimenting, we're trying something out, and maybe there's no solution yet, but we're moving forward to that. I think there's a great opportunity in education here as a source for unbelievable ideas.
Thank you, Oliver. Oh my God, this is really so fascinating. I would love to continue the discussion. I was formerly the president of the Indus Entrepreneurs for DC, Virginia, and Maryland, and we just had our tie pitch competition for young entrepreneurs. So when you were talking about entrepreneurial journeys, and again, I'm a sponsor and funder for that as well. It's just fascinating. I would love to continue the discussion, see how we can get more people engaged. I'm sure a lot of young people today from CCBC, you've gotten creative juices for a lot of these kids and opened their minds and hearts with the lessons that both of you shared, Ifat and Oliver. And we are so appreciative and grateful to both of you for being willing to share your incredible knowledge, your lessons learned, all of your years and years of research, and condense it. And I was particularly appreciative and grateful that normally in the live sessions, we would wave our time cards, 5 minutes left, 3 minutes left, 2 minutes left. We didn't even have to do that. And you guys self-monitored and timed. You did have your fancy snazzy.
That is a Stream Deck that has a 25-minute customized timer, and it beeped me out. So lessons learned from COVID. You gotta gadget up.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being amazing speakers, and more important, keeping your time and helping to change the world with your work each day. And with that, I am going to pass it back to CCBC, Dr. Kurtinitis, and your team there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sheila. Thank you for everything. Thank you for introducing our speakers, for your nice words, and then taking the questions and doing a wonderful introduction to our wonderful speakers. I cannot thank you enough. I would like personally, and then on behalf of CCBC and Global Education Advisory Board, to thank you both speakers. It's been a pleasure working with all of you. And then it's been a pleasure talking to you virtually and then having you today. It really was a pleasure to work with you throughout this entire process. Since the first day I sent the email invitation to both of you. I personally like to thank you and then on behalf of everyone at CCBC, thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation. And then Sheila, you said it the best. These are great speakers with a lot of knowledge. And then we are so blessed and very lucky to have both of them today. So on behalf of everyone, thank you so much. And then thank you to everyone who participated to make this event one more time a great event. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a great afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Ifat. Thank you, Dr. Kurtinitis. Thank you to Dr. Azar. Take care, everybody. We're going to change the world working together with such brilliant teachers, mentors, advisors, guides. Continue to rock and make CCBC proud, your family proud, and the world proud. Thank you, thank you, thank you.